The wind carried a kind of hush that only winter could weave, a silence so complete it pressed against the chest like a weight. Snow drifted across the narrow trail, blurring hoofprints as soon as they were made, yet the lone rider pressed on, a dark figure moving through a landscape stripped bare. His name was Jesse Coulter, though few in the town ahead would remember it, and fewer still would care. He rode with his hat brim low, scarf pulled high, a man who had learned long ago that silence was safer than conversation. The horse beneath him plodded steadily, breath steaming in pale bursts that mingled with the frosted air, each step pulling them closer to Hollow Creek. The town revealed itself slowly, lantern light leaking through frosted windows, chimneys coughing up thin streams of smoke that vanished against the gray sky. Wooden signs swung on rusty chains, creaking when the wind passed through, while shutters clattered against worn boards. Jesse had been here once before, years ago, but memory was a slippery thing, and the faces that might have once greeted him warmly had long since faded into strangers. He entered as a man enters a church he does not believe in, quietly, respectfully, yet prepared for the cold edge of judgment. Hollow Creek was the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than horses. Folks peered through curtains as Jesse guided his mare down the slushy main road, eyes sharp and measuring. A stranger's presence was reason enough to stir whispers, and Jesse knew the sound of them even if he could not hear their words. He tethered his horse outside the general store, patted her neck, and felt the stiffness in his own fingers. Supplies, nothing more. That was the reason he had come. Flour, salt, maybe coffee if the price wasn't bitter. He meant to be gone before the town had time to weigh him like a coin in their palm. But before he could step inside, he saw her. She was seated on the wooden bench that sagged beneath the store's window, the lace of her gown spread across the snow-stained boards like a memory left out in the cold. A thin shawl clung to her shoulders, trembling as much from the wind as from her own shivers. Her hair, once pinned with care, now hung loose, strands frozen into brittle curls. She could not have been more than 20, though hunger and humiliation had aged the light in her eyes. She held out her hands, not openly, not brazen like a beggar, but with the quiet desperation of someone who had been taught dignity once, and still tried to clutch its frayed threads. "Bread," she whispered to the passers-by, her voice hardly more than the crackle of a dying flame. Most hurried past with stiff backs, their breath puffing white in the air. A few men smirked, muttering words that stung sharper than frost. One woman pulled her child closer, as though the sight of the young bride might stain him. Jesse froze where he stood, the cold no longer coming from the wind. Something in the sight of her clawed at him, something raw, familiar. He had seen that same look once in the eyes of his late wife during her last days of fever, a kind of pleading without words, a hunger beyond food. He shifted his weight, boots crunching in the snow, torn between entering the store and stepping away entirely. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He had no room for another soul's sorrow. But the image of her trembling fingers would not release him. He moved past her, tugged the store door open, and stepped into warmth that smelled of kerosene, leather, and stacked grain sacks. The bell above the door rang, announcing him as it had every stranger before. Heads turned inside, 2 women at the counter, the shopkeeper weighing flour, a boy sweeping dust from the floor. Their eyes lingered on him with suspicion, then returned to their business, though Jesse could feel their stares still pressing against his back. He asked for flour, salt, coffee, his voice low but steady. The coins he laid on the counter clinked loud enough to mark him as a man who paid honestly, yet that honesty did little to soften the shopkeeper's wary nod. When the supplies were wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, Jesse carried them back out into the biting air. She was still there, shoulders hunched, face lowered. Snowflakes clung to her lashes like tiny barbs. For a moment he hesitated again, then with a breath that felt heavier than his own body, he stepped toward her. Without a word, he untied the string around his parcel, pulled free the small loaf of bread he had included almost without thinking, and set it gently on her lap. Her head lifted, eyes wide and hollow. She looked at the bread as though it were a miracle, then at him as though she could not decide whether to thank him or curse him for the shame of needing it. No word passed between them. She did not smile. She did not weep. She only held the loaf with trembling fingers and drew it close to her chest, as though protecting something fragile. Jesse turned away before the moment could grow heavier, adjusting his parcels beneath his arm. Behind him, whispers rose, hushed but sharp. A man muttered something crude. A woman clucked her tongue. The judgment was not hers alone now. It belonged to him as well, simply for having shown her kindness. He ignored it, though the weight of their scorn pressed against his shoulders as surely as the snow. That night, Jesse took a room above the saloon. The walls were thin, the whiskey cheap, but the fire in the hearth fought back the cold. He unpacked his supplies, set them neatly on the table, then sat with his hands folded. From his window he could see the narrow street below, lamps flickering against the snow-dusted ground. The town moved like shadows, boots splashing in half-frozen puddles, carriages creaking, laughter spilling from doorways. Somewhere beyond those shadows, Clara May Dawson, though he did not yet know her name, was out there, clutching her bread, wearing a gown that had once promised a future and now only promised frostbite. Jesse closed his eyes, but the vision would not leave him. The curve of her shoulders bent under shame, the quiet strength that had refused to cry even when surrounded by scorn. He found no peace in whiskey that night. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering wagon ruts and footprints alike. It softened the world, as though winter wished to hide the cruelty men left behind. Yet Jesse knew some wounds could not be buried, no matter how deep the snow. He thought of leaving at dawn, as he had planned, riding out with supplies enough to last him until the thaw. But another thought pulled at him with stubborn persistence, that some hungers could not be fed with bread alone. The fire burned low, shadows danced across the wooden floor, and Jesse sat still as stone, the quiet ache of the day settling into his bones. Sleep would not come easy. The image of her remained, etched sharper than the cold outside, as though fate had placed her in his path not for chance, but for choice. And choices, Jesse knew, had a way of changing the course of a man's life, even when all he wanted was to pass unnoticed through the snow. Morning came with a brittle light, the kind that painted every rooftop in silver yet offered no warmth. Jesse saddled his mare with slow hands, the kind of slowness that betrayed hesitation. He had told himself through half the night that he would leave Hollow Creek before the town decided what story to pin on him, but his boots lingered on the boards, his gaze drifting toward the street below where life carried on with familiar cruelties. The bride was there again, sweeping snow from the saloon steps with a broken broom, her gown hem tattered and damp, shawl drawn tight against her frame. She worked not for coin, but for a place near the kitchen stove, a small mercy granted by men who laughed too loudly whenever she passed. Jesse watched, jaw tight, then turned away, yet the echo of the broom scraping would follow him even as he led his horse through the morning frost. He told himself to ride, but instead he tied the reins once more and walked down the street. Clara May Dawson glanced up only briefly when his shadow crossed hers, then lowered her eyes, continuing her work with stubborn silence. There was no gratitude in her look, no plea either, only the faint trace of pride still clinging like frost to glass. He bent, picked up a stray nail from the snow, and pressed it into her palm. She frowned, confused, until he gestured toward the wobbling wagon wheel propped against the saloon wall. Without words, he crouched to repair it, the cold biting his fingers as he worked. She watched quietly, then disappeared inside, returning moments later with a tin cup of coffee, steaming faintly. She set it beside him without comment. That was how their language began, not through speech, but through traded gestures, quiet acts that stitched a fragile thread between two people frayed by life. The town noticed. It always noticed. Whispers crawled through Hollow Creek faster than fire through dry grass. By midday, folks at the mercantile spoke of the drifter and the ruined bride, their voices laced with scorn, their laughter sharp as icicles. Jesse heard it when he passed, but he did not slow his step. Clara heard it too, though she wore her silence like armor. Still, the armor cracked when she thought no one was watching, when she stood at the well, shoulders hunched, her reflection in the water trembling with the ripples of her breath. One evening, Sheriff Holt McCready intercepted Jesse outside the stable. The lawman was broad-shouldered, his voice steady as granite. "Coulter," he said, "best keep clear of that girl. She's trouble you don't need. This town's already decided what she is. Don't let 'em decide the same about you." Jesse met his gaze but offered no reply, only tightened the strap on his saddle and walked away. Words would not change the sheriff's mind, nor the town's, but Jesse felt something harder than resolve take root in his chest. It was a night later when the laughter grew cruelest. Jesse had returned to the saloon for a meal, the room thick with smoke and the clatter of dice. Clara swept between tables, collecting empty mugs. A group of ranch hands, loose with drink, leaned close together, their voices just loud enough for the room to hear. They placed mock wagers on how long it would take before she sold more than her labor, their coins clinking against the table like nails in a coffin. The sound sliced through Jessie's meal. Clara froze, her face turned away, but her knuckles whitened around the tray she carried. Jessie rose slowly, his chair scraping the floor with a sound that silenced half the room. He set his hat carefully on the table, as though even that gesture carried weight. Crossing the floor, he stopped before Clara and, without a glance toward the men, extended his hand. She stared at it, confusion and shame flickering in her eyes, until he gave the smallest nod. She placed her hand in his, trembling though she tried to steady it. Together they walked out, past the stunned faces and stilled mugs, into the cold night air where the snow had begun again to fall. Outside, she pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. Jessie studied her for a moment, then removed his gloves and pressed them into her hands. Her breath hitched at the warmth left inside them, and for the first time, her eyes softened with something like trust. She told him the truth then, in fragments carried by the wind. Her name was Clara May Dawson. She had stood in the chapel 2 months past, veil drawn, heart steady, only for her groom to vanish before vows were spoken. He left her with debts unpaid and a reputation shattered, leaving Hollow Creek to feast on the ruin he abandoned. Pride had carried her as far as it could, but pride could not buy bread, nor pay for shelter. She had begged, not because she wanted to, but because hunger stripped choice from a person. Her voice broke when she said it, though her eyes held steady on his, daring him to flinch at her disgrace. Jessie did not flinch. He told her, with equal sparseness, of the woman he had buried years before, of the fever that stole her breath in the middle of summer, of the silence left in her place. He told it plainly, without flourish, and when he fell quiet, Clara did not look away. 2 wounded lives stood there in the snow, and though neither reached for comfort in words, both recognized the reflection of their own sorrow in the other. The following morning, gossip spread faster than ever. The saloon keeper claimed Jessie had declared her his. The women at the well said she had bewitched him. Men laughed openly in the street. Yet Jessie did not bend beneath their judgment. He walked beside Clara when she crossed the square, not holding her arm but simply near enough that no man dared step between them. Dignity, he believed, was not a thing one could grant another, but it could be restored, piece by piece, through presence, through recognition, through the refusal to turn away. The storm that had been brewing in whispers finally broke that night. Clara returned to the saloon to sweep, as always, but the ranch hands who had mocked her before grew bolder. Drink had sharpened their tongues. They jeered as she passed, one reaching to tug at the torn lace of her gown. The room laughed. Jessie rose once more, but this time his stillness before moving was sharper, the kind that drew every gaze without demand. He walked across the floor, shoulders steady, and took the tray from Clara's trembling grip. Setting it aside, he placed his arm gently at her back, guiding her upright. The laughter faltered. He did not speak, not to the men nor to the room, but the silence he carried was louder than any words. Together they walked out, and no one followed. Snow fell heavy outside, wrapping the town in white silence. Clara stopped under the glow of a single lantern, her breath rising in fragile clouds. She looked at Jessie with eyes no longer hollow, though fear still lingered at the edges. "Why?" she asked, the word trembling between them. Jessie met her gaze, his voice low, steady. "Because you're worth more than their laughter." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her shoulders straightened, the lace of her gown no less tattered but her bearing transformed. She was no longer the girl begging on a bench, nor the outcast sweeping for scraps. In that moment, she carried herself like someone rediscovering the shape of her own dignity. When dawn came, Jessie prepared to leave as he had always intended. Yet this time, when he lifted himself into the saddle, another figure stood at his side. Clara held no possessions save the shawl around her shoulders, but when he offered his hand, she placed hers in it without hesitation. She mounted behind him, arms circling lightly at his waist, not in possession but in trust. The horse moved forward, hooves breaking the snow's crust, carrying them both beyond the edges of Hollow Creek. The town watched from behind curtains and doorways, silent for once. Their gossip could follow, but the sound of it no longer mattered. What mattered was the steady rhythm of hooves carrying two souls into the wide white horizon, bound not by vows or promises, but by the quiet courage to leave shame behind. And as the wind swallowed the trail of their passing, it left behind a lesson as sharp as the winter air. Dignity is not given by the world, nor taken by its scorn. It is found in the small mercies we choose, in the hands we lift from the snow, in the silences we share when words would only cheapen the truth. So remember this, you who carry hungers of your own. When the world turns its back, when laughter cuts sharper than knives, may you find the grace to rise. And if the road ahead feels empty, ride onward still, for somewhere beyond the frost lies a horizon where your dignity waits to meet you. If this tale stirred your heart, stay close with us here in Wild West Tales. Subscribe, so more stories of quiet courage may find their way to you.